The morning sun cast long shadows across the entrance of Fort Harrison Military Base as Sarah Chen adjusted the collar of her simple civilian clothes. At 28, she had learned to blend into any crowd, a skill that served her well in her unique position within the military intelligence community. Today, however, that same ability to appear ordinary would lead to an incident that would ripple through the highest levels of command. Sarah approached the main gate with measured steps, her weathered brown leather bag slung over her shoulder. Inside that bag were documents that could change the course of military operations across 3 continents. But to any observer, she looked like just another civilian contractor arriving for work. The morning shift change had just occurred, and Private Tommy Rodriguez, fresh from basic training and eager to prove himself, stood at attention behind the security checkpoint. The base hummed with its usual activity. Trucks rumbled past carrying supplies, soldiers jogged in formation along the perimeter road, and the distant sound of helicopter rotors filled the air. Fort Harrison was one of the most strategically important installations in the country, housing advanced research facilities and serving as a coordination center for international operations. Security protocols here were supposed to be absolute, with no exceptions for anyone regardless of rank or clearance level. Sarah reached the checkpoint and smiled politely at Private Rodriguez. She had been through this gate hundreds of times over the past 2 years, usually without incident. Her security clearance was among the highest in the military, and her face was well known to most of the regular guards. However, Rodriguez was new, having been assigned to gate duty just 3 days earlier as part of his initial posting. "Good morning," Sarah said, reaching into her bag. "I'm here for the intelligence briefing with Colonel Matthews." Rodriguez looked at her with the intensity of someone determined to follow every rule to the letter. His training had emphasized the importance of proper identification procedures, and he had been specifically told that the base had recently upgraded its security measures following concerns about potential threats. He noticed that Sarah was reaching for something in her bag, but his attention was also drawn to her civilian appearance and the casual way she approached the checkpoint. "Ma'am, I'll need to see your military identification and visitor authorization," Rodriguez said, his voice crisp and professional. He had been taught that maintaining proper protocol was essential, regardless of how routine a situation might appear. Sarah paused, her hand still in her bag. She realized that this guard didn't recognize her, which wasn't entirely surprising given the regular rotation of security personnel. "Of course," she replied, beginning to pull out her identification card. The card itself was unremarkable in appearance, designed to avoid drawing attention, but it contained embedded security features that would immediately identify her clearance level when scanned. However, as Sarah withdrew the card, Rodriguez noticed something that made him hesitate. Her identification didn't look like the standard military IDs he had been trained to expect. The format was different, lacking some of the visible security features he had memorized during his training. What Rodriguez didn't know was that Sarah's identification was part of a specialized system used by intelligence operatives, with security features that weren't visible to standard screening equipment used at most checkpoints. "Ma'am, this doesn't look like a standard military ID," Rodriguez said, examining the card more closely. His training had emphasized being suspicious of any documentation that didn't match the expected format, and Sarah's card definitely fell into that category. Sarah maintained her patient demeanor, understanding the guard's concern but also aware that she had a critical meeting in less than 15 minutes. "It's a specialized clearance card," she explained. "You can verify it through your system, or you can call Colonel Matthews' office to confirm my appointment." Rodriguez felt a growing sense of uncertainty. His supervisors had stressed the importance of not allowing anyone through the gate without proper verification, but they had also warned him about the consequences of unnecessarily delaying authorized personnel. He looked at the identification card again, noting its unfamiliar design and the fact that it didn't seem to match any of the examples he had been shown during training. The checkpoint area began to show signs of building tension. Other personnel waiting to enter the base started to form a line behind Sarah, some checking their watches with obvious impatience. Among them were several officers who recognized Sarah but were too far away to hear the conversation at the checkpoint. The normal flow of morning traffic was beginning to back up, creating exactly the kind of situation that base security protocols were designed to prevent. "I'm going to need you to step aside while I verify this with my supervisor," Rodriguez announced, his voice becoming more formal. He was following the procedures he had been taught, but he was also beginning to feel the pressure of the situation. The other people in line were clearly becoming frustrated, and he could sense that this was becoming more complicated than a routine ID check. Sarah glanced at her watch and felt a flash of concern. The intelligence briefing she was scheduled to attend involved time-sensitive information about ongoing operations in Eastern Europe. Delays could have serious consequences, but she also understood that the guard was simply doing his job. She decided to try a different approach. "Private Rodriguez," she said, reading his name tag. "I understand your concern about the identification format. Can you please call the base intelligence office and ask them to verify my clearance? Tell them Sarah Chen is at the main gate." Rodriguez nodded and reached for his radio, but as he did so, he realized he wasn't entirely sure what department he should call. His training had focused primarily on standard military personnel and civilian contractors with visitor passes. The intelligence office wasn't part of his usual contact list, and he wasn't sure about the proper protocol for this type of situation. Meanwhile, the line behind Sarah continued to grow. Several officers were now openly expressing their frustration, and one of them, Major Williams from the logistics department, approached the checkpoint. Williams had seen Sarah at various briefings and knew she was someone important, though he wasn't entirely sure of her exact role or clearance level. "Is there a problem here, Private?" Major Williams asked, his tone carrying the authority of his rank. Rodriguez snapped to attention, grateful for the intervention, but also nervous about explaining the situation to a superior officer. "Sir, this civilian is presenting identification that doesn't match our standard formats, and I'm trying to verify her authorization to enter the base." Major Williams looked at Sarah and recognized her immediately. He had seen her at several high-level briefings and knew she worked closely with the intelligence community. However, he also realized that he didn't know enough about her specific clearance level to override the guard's concerns. The situation was becoming awkward for everyone involved. "Private, have you attempted to contact the intelligence office for verification?" Major Williams asked. "I was just about to do that, sir," Rodriguez replied, still holding his radio but clearly uncertain about the proper procedure. Sarah watched this exchange with growing concern. She understood that both men were trying to follow proper protocols, but the delay was becoming problematic. The intelligence briefing was scheduled to begin in 8 minutes, and the information she needed to present was crucial for ongoing operations. She decided to provide additional information that might help resolve the situation.
"Major Williams, I believe you've seen me at the weekly intelligence briefings," Sarah said.
"I work directly with Colonel Matthews and General Patterson on classified operations. Perhaps you could contact Colonel Matthews's office to expedite this verification." Williams nodded, recognizing the wisdom of this approach. He was familiar enough with Sarah to feel comfortable vouching for her, but he also understood the importance of maintaining proper security procedures. "Private Rodriguez, please contact Colonel Matthews' office immediately and request verification for Ms. Chen." Rodriguez felt relieved to have clear direction from a superior officer. He quickly dialed the number for Colonel Matthews' office, hoping to resolve the situation quickly and efficiently. However, when the phone rang, he was connected to an automated system that directed him through a series of menu options, none of which seemed to apply to his current situation. As Rodriguez navigated the phone system, the backup at the gate continued to worsen. The morning shift change meant that many personnel were trying to enter the base simultaneously, and the delay at the main checkpoint was creating a bottleneck that extended beyond the base perimeter. Cars were backing up onto the main road, and the situation was beginning to attract attention from base security supervisors. Sarah realized that the situation was spiraling beyond what anyone had anticipated. What should have been a simple identification check was now involving multiple personnel and causing significant disruption to base operations. She knew that her specialized clearance and unconventional identification format were at the root of the problem, but she also understood that the guard was simply following his training. The morning air grew warmer as the sun climbed higher, and tensions at the checkpoint continued to build. Several more officers had joined the growing crowd, some offering to vouch for Sarah, while others insisted that proper procedures must be followed regardless of personal recognition. The debate was becoming heated, with strong opinions on both sides about the appropriate balance between security and operational efficiency. Private Rodriguez finally reached a human operator in Colonel Matthews' office, but the person who answered was unfamiliar with Sarah's name and couldn't immediately locate any record of a scheduled meeting. The confusion was compounded by the fact that many intelligence operations were conducted under strict need-to-know protocols, meaning that administrative staff often weren't aware of all meetings and appointments. The situation had now attracted the attention of Sergeant Williams, the gate supervisor, who approached the checkpoint with obvious concern about the growing disruption. Williams was an experienced non-commissioned officer who had dealt with similar situations before, but he had never encountered a case involving someone with Sarah's type of specialized clearance. "What's the situation here, Private?" Sergeant Williams asked, surveying the crowd of frustrated personnel and the backed-up traffic. Rodriguez quickly explained the identification issue, his voice betraying the stress he was feeling about the escalating situation. Sergeant Williams examined Sarah's identification card and immediately recognized that it was unlike anything in his experience. The card's design and security features were clearly sophisticated, but they didn't match any of the standard formats he had been trained to recognize. As the standoff continued, none of the people involved could have predicted that this seemingly routine identification check would soon involve the highest levels of military command. The morning that had started with such ordinary promise was about to take a dramatic turn that would leave everyone questioning their assumptions about protocol, authority, and the sometimes unexpected ways that the military hierarchy operates. The clock above the checkpoint showed that Sarah's scheduled briefing time had now passed, and the implications of this delay were beginning to extend far beyond the immediate situation at the gate. Inside the base command center, Colonel Matthews glanced at the clock on his wall with growing irritation. The intelligence briefing was supposed to have started 10 minutes ago, and Sarah Chen's absence was completely out of character. In the 2 years he had worked with her, she had never been late for a meeting, let alone missed one entirely. The information she was bringing today was critical for a decision that needed to be made within the next hour. Matthews picked up his secure phone and dialed his assistant. "Lisa, have you heard anything from Sarah Chen? She was supposed to be here for the 0800 briefing." "No, sir," came the reply. "I did receive a strange call a few minutes ago from someone at the main gate asking about her, but the connection was poor and I couldn't understand what they were asking." A cold feeling settled in Matthew's stomach. Sarah Chen wasn't just any intelligence officer. She was a specialist in deep cover operations, someone whose work often took her into situations where her safety depended on maintaining the lowest possible profile. If something had happened to her on the way to the base, the implications could be serious not just for ongoing operations, but for national security. Matthews immediately contacted base security and requested a status report on all gate activity. What he learned made his concern turn to alarm. According to the security office, there had been an ongoing situation at the main gate for the past 20 minutes involving an unidentified civilian with questionable documentation. The description matched Sarah perfectly. "Get me General Patterson's office immediately," Matthews ordered his assistant. General Patterson was Sarah's direct superior and one of only a handful of people who fully understood the scope of her work and clearance level. Meanwhile, at the gate, Sergeant Williams had made the decision to contact the base Provost Marshal's office. The situation had escalated beyond what he felt comfortable handling at the checkpoint level, and the growing crowd of delayed personnel was creating security concerns of its own. The Provost Marshal, Lieutenant Colonel James Harrison, was responsible for all base security and would have the authority to make definitive decisions about unusual situations like this. Sarah remained calm despite the mounting tension around her. She understood that each person involved was trying to do their job correctly, but she also knew that every minute of delay was potentially compromising time-sensitive intelligence operations. She had been in difficult situations before, and her training had taught her the importance of maintaining composure even when circumstances seemed to be spiraling out of control. "Sergeant Williams," Sarah said quietly, "I understand the complexity of this situation. Perhaps I could provide additional information that might help verify my identity and clearance level." Williams nodded gratefully. He was experienced enough to recognize that this wasn't a standard security threat, but he was also aware that the procedures existed for good reasons. "What additional information can you provide, ma'am?" Sarah considered her options carefully. Her work required maintaining operational security at all times, but the current situation was threatening to compromise her mission more than a limited disclosure of information would. I can provide you with a special contact number that will connect you directly to the Intelligence Authentication Office. They can verify my clearance and authorization within minutes. This was information that Sarah rarely shared, as the Authentication Office was a highly classified resource, used only in extreme circumstances. However, the current situation clearly qualified as an emergency that justified breaking standard protocol. Williams accepted the phone number and immediately placed the call. The person who answered clearly understood the significance of the call and asked for specific identification codes that Sarah was able to provide from memory. However, the authentication process would take several minutes to complete, and the situation at the gate was continuing to deteriorate. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison arrived at the checkpoint just as Williams was completing the authentication call. Harrison was known throughout the base for his no-nonsense approach to security and his unwillingness to bend rules for anyone regardless of rank or position. His presence immediately elevated the seriousness of the situation. "Sergeant Williams, brief me on the situation," Harrison commanded, surveying the scene with the practiced eye of someone who had dealt with security incidents throughout his career. Williams quickly explained the identification issue and the ongoing authentication process. Harrison examined Sarah's identification card and immediately recognized that it was far more sophisticated than anything he had encountered in his years of security work. The card's design suggested a level of clearance that was well above his own, but he had been trained never to make assumptions based on appearances. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to remain here while we complete the verification process," Harrison informed Sarah. "This is standard procedure for any security situation involving questionable documentation." Sarah nodded her understanding, but she was becoming increasingly concerned about the operational implications of the delay. The intelligence she carried involved coordinated activities across multiple time zones, and delays could have cascading effects on operations that were already in progress. At that moment, the Authentication Office called back with verification of Sarah's identity and clearance level. The person who spoke with Williams was clearly surprised by the inquiry and emphasized the extraordinary nature of Sarah's authorization level. However, even with this verification, Harrison felt obligated to follow additional security protocols given the unusual circumstances. "The authentication confirms her identity," Williams reported to Harrison. "But they also indicated that her clearance level is higher than our standard verification systems are designed to handle." This information created a new dilemma for Harrison. His training had prepared him for dealing with various security situations, but he had never encountered someone whose clearance level exceeded his ability to verify through normal channels. The situation was unprecedented in his experience. As Harrison considered his options, his radio crackled with an urgent message from the base command center. Colonel Matthews was requesting immediate contact regarding a missing intelligence officer. The timing of this message, combined with the ongoing situation at the gate, created a clear connection that even Harrison couldn't ignore. "Sergeant Williams, contact Colonel Matthews immediately and inform him that we may have located his missing officer," Harrison ordered. He was beginning to understand that this situation was far more significant than a routine identification check. The call to Matthews was answered immediately, and the colonel's relief was evident even over the radio. He requested that Sarah be escorted directly to the command center and asked that all personnel involved in the incident report to his office for debriefing within the hour. However, before the situation could be resolved, the base public address system crackled to life with an announcement that sent a chill through everyone present. "All security personnel report Code Yellow alert status immediately. This is not a drill." Code Yellow indicated a potential security breach that could affect base operations. The timing of this alert, coming in the middle of Sarah's delayed arrival, suggested that the intelligence she was carrying might be even more critical than anyone had realized. Harrison's radio immediately came alive with traffic from the base security center. Intelligence from multiple sources was indicating unusual activity around several military installations, and there were concerns about coordinated reconnaissance efforts by hostile forces. The information that Sarah was bringing to the briefing was apparently connected to these developing threats. "Ma'am, we need to get you to the command center immediately," Harrison told Sarah. his tone now reflecting urgency rather than suspicion. The security situation had suddenly made her delayed briefing a priority for the entire base. As they prepared to leave the checkpoint, Harrison noticed unusual activity on the perimeter road leading to the base. Several unmarked vehicles had appeared in the distance, moving in a formation that suggested official rather than civilian purposes. This was highly unusual, as most official visits were coordinated in advance through the base command structure. The vehicles approached the gate at a measured pace, their occupants clearly visible through the windows but not immediately identifiable. The lead vehicle had distinctive license plates that suggested high-level government or military affiliation, but the specific codes weren't familiar to any of the gate personnel. Harrison felt a growing sense that the morning's events were connected in ways he didn't fully understand. The identification issue with Sarah, the code yellow alert, and now the appearance of these official vehicles seemed too coincidental to be unrelated. His years of security experience had taught him to trust his instincts when patterns emerged, even when he couldn't immediately see the full picture. Sarah watched the approaching vehicles with interest but no apparent surprise. Her expression suggested that she might have been expecting some kind of official response to her delayed arrival, but she offered no explanation to the increasingly curious security personnel. "Do you know anything about these vehicles, ma'am?" Harrison asked, his security training compelling him to gather as much information as possible about the developing situation. "I believe they may be related to the intelligence briefing that I was scheduled to attend," Sarah replied carefully. "The information I'm carrying has implications that extend beyond this base, and it's possible that higher authority has been notified of the delays." This explanation did little to ease Harrison's concern. If Sarah's delayed briefing had triggered a response from higher authority, it suggested that the morning's identification issue had inadvertently interfered with something far more significant than a routine intelligence meeting. The lead vehicle pulled up to the checkpoint, and Harrison could see that its occupants were wearing military uniforms with insignia that indicated very high ranks. The situation was clearly escalating beyond anything he had authority to handle, and he realized that the next few minutes would determine whether the morning's events would be remembered as a minor security incident or something much more serious. As the vehicle doors began to open, Harrison made a mental note that this would definitely be a day he would never forget. The simple identification check that had started the morning was about to become something that would require explanations at levels of command he had never personally encountered. The first person to emerge from the lead vehicle was a man in his early 60s, wearing the distinctive uniform of a 3-star general. His bearing and the immediate deference shown by his accompanying staff made it clear that this was someone accustomed to command at the highest levels. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison felt his stomach drop as he recognized the insignia of General Robert Morrison, the regional command authority whose jurisdiction covered dozens of military installations across the country. Behind Morrison came a second general, this one wearing the 4-star insignia of General Patricia Stevens, whom Harrison recognized from military publications as one of the most senior intelligence officials in the armed forces. The presence of 2 generals of this rank at a routine base gate was unprecedented in Harrison's experience, and he began to understand that the morning's events had triggered responses that reached the very top of the military hierarchy. Private Rodriguez, who had started the morning simply hoping to do his job correctly, now found himself at the center of a situation involving some of the most powerful people in the military. His training had never prepared him for this level of scrutiny, and he stood at rigid attention, unsure whether he should speak or remain silent. A third vehicle disgorged General Michael Chen, a 2-star general whose specialty in international operations made his presence particularly significant. Harrison noticed that General Chen's arrival coincided with increased radio traffic, indicating that other bases were also experiencing heightened security alerts. The scope of whatever Sarah had been bringing to her briefing was clearly much larger than anyone at Fort Harrison had realized. "Lieutenant Colonel Harrison," General Morrison addressed him directly, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to immediate compliance. "I need a complete briefing on the situation that has delayed one of our most critical intelligence officers." Harrison snapped to attention and began a precise recitation of the morning's events, starting with Private Rodriguez's initial concerns about Sarah's identification and continuing through the various verification attempts and escalating involvement of base personnel. He was careful to emphasize that all personnel had followed established procedures and that no one had acted outside their authority or training. General Stevens listened to the briefing with the focused attention of someone evaluating every detail for its operational significance. When Harrison finished his report, she turned her attention to Sarah, her expression revealing both concern and urgency. "Ms. Chen, I apologize for the delay you've experienced this morning. I understand that you have time-sensitive intelligence that affects operations across multiple theaters. Can you provide us with an immediate assessment of any compromises that may have resulted from this delay?" Sarah's response was measured, but clearly indicated the seriousness of the situation. "General Stevens, the intelligence I'm carrying includes real-time coordination data for operations in Eastern Europe and the Pacific. We've now missed 2 critical communication windows, and Allied forces are operating without updated threat assessments that were scheduled to be distributed an hour ago." The implications of this statement hit everyone present like a physical blow. Private Rodriguez realized that his careful adherence to identification procedures had inadvertently delayed intelligence that was affecting military operations on the other side of the world. The weight of this realization was almost overwhelming for a soldier who had been in the military for less than 6 months. General Morrison turned to address the assembled personnel with an expression that combined understanding with unmistakable authority. "I want everyone here to understand that what happened this morning represents both a failure of our systems and a success of our training." Private Rodriguez followed his instructions exactly as he was taught, and every person who became involved in this situation acted according to their training and authority. This statement provided some relief to the tense atmosphere, but Morrison continued with observations that made clear the complexity of the issues involved. "However, this incident has revealed gaps in our procedures for handling personnel with extraordinary clearance levels. We cannot allow operational security concerns to compromise critical intelligence operations. But we also cannot compromise base security by creating exceptions to established procedures." A 4th vehicle arrived during Morrison's remarks, and from it emerged General David Kim, whose specialty in technological warfare systems indicated that the morning's intelligence briefing involved cutting-edge military capabilities. Kim's presence meant that at least 4 different military specialties were represented among the general officers who had responded to Sarah's delayed arrival. General Kim approached Sarah directly, bypassing the normal protocols for interaction between high-ranking officers and intelligence personnel. "Ms. Chen, I need to understand the current status of the technological intelligence you were bringing to the briefing. Our Pacific operations are standing by for threat assessments that should have been distributed before dawn." Sarah's response indicated that the delay had created cascading problems across multiple operations. "General Kim, we've missed the primary distribution window, but I believe we can still implement emergency protocols to get the information to field commanders within the next 30 minutes. However, this will require bypassing some of our normal security verification procedures." This statement highlighted one of the most challenging aspects of military operations, the constant tension between maintaining security and ensuring operational effectiveness. The morning's identification delay had forced decision-makers to choose between compromising security protocols and potentially compromising ongoing military operations. A 5th general arrived as these discussions were taking place. General Sarah Williams, a specialist in international liaison operations, brought with her the news that Allied forces had been inquiring about the delayed intelligence distributions. The situation was no longer contained within American military channels, but was beginning to affect international military cooperation. "The delay has been noted by our NATO partners," General Williams reported. "They're beginning to implement contingency protocols based on the assumption that our intelligence may have been compromised or that we're experiencing communication failures." This development added an international dimension to what had started as a simple identification check at a single military base. Private Rodriguez, still standing at attention and trying to process the magnitude of what his routine security check had triggered, began to understand that military procedures existed within a complex web of interconnected operations that could be affected by seemingly minor decisions. General Morrison made the decision to convene an immediate field briefing at the gate area, rather than wasting additional time moving to the command center. This was highly unusual, as sensitive intelligence was normally discussed only in secure conference facilities, but the time constraints and operational urgency justified extraordinary measures. A 6th general arrived as Morrison was setting up the impromptu briefing area. General Thomas Anderson, whose expertise in crisis management had made him a key figure in multiple international incidents, brought with him communication equipment that would allow real-time coordination with operations around the world. "We're going to conduct an emergency intelligence distribution from this location," Anderson announced. "Chen, I need you to brief all commanders simultaneously using our emergency broadcast protocols. This will bypass normal security channels, but operational necessity takes precedence." The transformation of the gate area into a temporary command center was remarkable to witness. Within minutes, communication equipment was deployed, secure connections were established with military installations around the world, and the morning's routine security checkpoint became the focal point for coordinating international military operations. Sarah began her delayed briefing, and the content immediately made clear why so many high-ranking officers had responded to news of her delay. The intelligence involved coordinated threats against multiple Allied installations, technological capabilities that could affect the balance of power in several regions, and time-sensitive opportunities for disrupting hostile operations. A seventh general arrived during Sarah's briefing, General Rebecca Foster, whose role in strategic planning made her one of the most influential officers in the military, had apparently been monitoring the situation from another location and had traveled to Fort Harrison to participate directly in the crisis response. "The intelligence misery Chen is providing confirms several threat assessments we've been tracking," General Foster announced to the assembled group. "The delay this morning has forced us to accelerate our response timeline, but we can still achieve our operational objectives if we act within the next 2 hours." Private Rodriguez, still present at the checkpoint that had become the center of international military coordination, began to understand that his morning's work had inadvertently become part of a much larger story. The identification procedures that had seemed so important at 0800 now appeared insignificant compared to the global operations that were being coordinated just a few feet from where he stood. The presence of 7 generals at a single military base gate was unprecedented in peacetime, and the situation was beginning to attract attention from base personnel who could see the unusual activity from various points around Fort Harrison. However, the focus remained entirely on recovering from the morning's delays and ensuring that critical operations could proceed without further compromise. As Sarah continued her briefing and the generals coordinated their responses, it became clear that the morning's events would have lasting implications not just for Fort Harrison, but for military procedures throughout the entire command structure. The simple question of identification, verification, had revealed systemic issues that would require attention at the highest levels of military leadership. The emergency briefing continued for another hour as the 7 generals coordinated responses to the delayed intelligence. What had become clear during Sarah's presentation was that her information was part of a larger intelligence picture involving threats that required immediate action across multiple theaters of operation. The morning's delay had compressed decision-making timelines and forced military leaders to accelerate responses that had been planned to unfold over several days. General Morrison, as the senior officer present, took command of the overall coordination effort. His experience in managing complex military operations made him the natural choice to oversee the recovery from the morning's delays. However, even Morrison was struck by the unique circumstances that had brought together so many high-ranking officers at a single location for an emergency that had started with a routine identification check. "Miss Even and I's. Chen," Morrison addressed Sarah as the briefing concluded, "I want you to understand that no blame attaches to you for this morning's delays. Your security protocols are designed exactly as they should be, and the identification procedures that caused the initial delay are appropriate for your level of clearance. The problem is that we haven't adequately prepared our security personnel to handle the exceptional cases that your work represents." This statement provided reassurance not only to Sarah but also to Private Rodriguez and the other base personnel who had been involved in the morning's events. The implication was that the military system had failed to properly prepare for the intersection of routine security procedures and extraordinary operational requirements. General Stevens, whose intelligence background made her particularly sensitive to the operational security implications of the morning's events, addressed the broader lessons that needed to be learned. "This incident has revealed that our security procedures are designed for normal cases, but they break down when confronted with personnel whose clearance and operational requirements exceed standard parameters. We need to develop protocols that can handle exceptional cases without compromising either security or operational effectiveness. The response to this observation came from General Foster, whose strategic planning experience had shown her similar issues in other contexts. The challenge is that truly secure systems require standardization, but exceptional operations require flexibility. Finding the right balance is one of the most difficult problems in military administration. As the generals continued their discussion of systemic issues, the immediate operational crisis was being resolved through the emergency coordination protocols that had been implemented. Allied forces around the world were receiving the delayed intelligence through secure channels, and operational timelines were being adjusted to account for the compressed decision-making window. General Kim, monitoring the technological aspects of the response, reported that the emergency distribution systems were functioning effectively despite the unusual circumstances. We've managed to get critical intelligence to all affected operations within acceptable timeframes. The delays have been costly, but they haven't compromised our fundamental operational capabilities. This news provided significant relief to everyone involved, but it also highlighted how close the morning's events had come to creating serious operational problems. The margin between successful crisis management and genuine operational compromise had been measured in minutes rather than hours. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, who had been observing the emergency coordination with fascination and concern, was approached by General Anderson for a detailed discussion of the security implications of the morning's events. Anderson's crisis management experience had taught him to look for systemic vulnerabilities that could be exploited by hostile forces. Lieutenant Colonel, I need you to consider whether this morning's events could be replicated deliberately by someone seeking to disrupt our operations, Anderson said. If hostile forces understand our identification procedures well enough, they might be able to create delays at critical moments by presenting documentation that requires extended verification. This observation opened an entirely new dimension of concern about the morning's events. What had appeared to be a simple procedural failure might actually represent a vulnerability that could be exploited for hostile purposes. Harrison's security training immediately recognized the importance of this possibility and began considering countermeasures. The discussion of potential vulnerabilities was interrupted by the arrival of additional personnel from the base command structure. Colonel Matthews, whose intelligence briefing had been the original destination for Sarah's morning visit, finally arrived at the gate area along with other senior staff members who had been coordinating response efforts from the command center. Matthews' presence allowed for a more complete picture of how the morning's delays had affected ongoing operations. His report indicated that the cascade of delays had required significant adjustments to operational timelines, but that critical objectives could still be achieved if coordination efforts continued to proceed smoothly. The intelligence Ms. Chen provided has been successfully distributed to all critical operations, Matthews reported to the assembled generals. However, the compressed timeline has forced us to bypass some of our normal verification and consultation procedures. We've managed to maintain operational effectiveness, but at the cost of some security protocols that we would normally consider essential. This trade-off between security and operational effectiveness was exactly the kind of difficult choice that military leaders faced regularly. But the morning's events had forced these decisions to be made under extreme time pressure and with incomplete information about potential consequences. General Morrison recognized that the immediate crisis had been successfully managed, but that the broader lessons of the morning's events required careful analysis and systematic responses. I'm directing that this incident be thoroughly reviewed by a joint committee, including representatives from security, intelligence, and operational commands. We need to develop better procedures for handling exceptional cases, without creating vulnerabilities that could be exploited by hostile forces. The commitment to systematic review provided reassurance that the morning's events would lead to improvements in military procedures, but it also highlighted how a simple identification check had revealed fundamental challenges in military administration that extended far beyond Fort Harrison. As the emergency coordination efforts began to wind down, Private Rodriguez found himself in the unusual position of being personally addressed by General Morrison. The senior officer's approach was both reassuring and educational, designed to help a young soldier understand the broader context of his morning's work. Private Rodriguez, I want you to understand that your actions this morning were entirely correct according to your training and authority. The fact that your adherence to procedures created operational challenges doesn't mean that you did anything wrong. Instead, it means that we need better procedures and better training to handle the exceptional cases that you encountered. This personal attention from such a high-ranking officer was overwhelming for Rodriguez, but Morrison continued with observations designed to help the young soldier learn from the experience. Military service often requires making decisions based on incomplete information and within the constraints of established procedures. Your job this morning was to follow your training, and you did that perfectly. The broader implications of those decisions are the responsibility of the command structure, not individual soldiers. The educational value of Morrison's remarks extended beyond Rodriguez to all the base personnel who had been involved in the morning's events. The general's approach demonstrated how military leadership could turn unexpected challenges into learning opportunities that strengthened the overall system. General Williams, whose international liaison experience had shown her similar procedural challenges in other contexts, added her own observations about the morning's events. What happened here today illustrates why international military cooperation requires such careful coordination. Small procedural differences between allied forces can create significant operational challenges when time-sensitive intelligence is involved. As the morning turned to afternoon, the 7 generals began preparing to return to their respective commands, but not before ensuring that comprehensive follow-up procedures were in place. The extraordinary gathering at Fort Harrison's main gate would be remembered as an example of how quickly military leadership could respond to unexpected challenges, but also as a reminder of how complex military operations had become in an interconnected world. Sarah Chen, whose delayed arrival had triggered the morning's events, was finally able to proceed to her originally scheduled activities, but with the knowledge that her work had inadvertently revealed important vulnerabilities in military procedures. Her specialized clearance and unique operational requirements had created a perfect storm of procedural challenges that required responses from the highest levels of military command. The main gate at Fort Harrison returned to normal operations as the afternoon progressed, but the morning's events had left lasting changes in how security personnel approached identification procedures for unusual cases. Private Rodriguez, in particular, had gained an understanding of military operations that far exceeded what his initial training had provided. The incident would be studied and analyzed for months to come, serving as a case study in military administration and crisis management. The simple question of identification verification had revealed fundamental challenges about balancing security requirements with operational effectiveness, challenges that would influence military procedures for years to come. Most importantly, the morning's events had demonstrated both the strengths and limitations of military systems designed to handle routine operations. When confronted with exceptional cases, these systems required the kind of rapid adaptation and high-level coordination that had been demonstrated so effectively at Fort Harrison's main gate on what had started as such an ordinary Tuesday morning.